All right, we're going to get started with our next invited speaker. So we're very honored to actually have join us with us Devin Pleuler of the Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment Partnership. He's a senior director of R&D for team operations at MLSE, with leadership roles in both the Sports Performance Lab and SportsX programs, tasked with executing strategic research initiatives for competitive advantage for all of the teams on the court, field, and ice. So you're talking multiple sports in this organization that he works with. Prior to that, he was part of the analytics department, led the analytics group for Toronto FC for 8 seasons, including winning MLS championship in 2017. So this is a sports champion right here, something not too many of us can say in this room. No offense. Sorry, I had to do it. Prior to that, he worked for Opta Sports, MLS, and as a soccer coach. So he has technical background in both computer science and goalkeeping, and is a regular contributor to the sports analytics academic community. And I will let him take it away from here. Thanks, Devin.
Thank you, Ron. Does this sound good? Sweet. All right. Thanks for the intro. My name's Devin, and I have just recently moved over from Toronto FC, which is an MLSE property, over into this new sort of MLSE centralized group. And as Ron said, we're sort of tasked with doing, strategic R&D across our entire group, right? So as you'd imagine, with anybody who typically works in the front office of a sporting organization in an analytics capacity, they're mostly concerned with things like who we're drafting at the during the draft, who am I trading for at the trade deadline, who am I signing in free agency. We don't really do that sort of stuff. What we're mostly focused on are things that those analysts don't have time to do, right? So these are longer term R&D projects, and some of them I can talk about and some of them I can't. But today I'm going to talk a bit about a model that I've sort of been playing with, I guess probably the last couple of years to some degree. There's been a couple different versions of this over time. And it's going to sort of start with a bit kind of talking a little bit about formations. And before we dive into the methods, I think it'd be helpful for everybody to have a little bit more of a foundation on sort of what formations are in soccer. And I'd sort of be remiss not to sort of refer to this particular book. It's a very dense book. I'm not sure if I've ever gotten through it in one go, called Inverting the Pyramid by Jonathan Wilson. And it really takes you on a pretty meandering history of the evolution of tactics. And it's easily the most recommended book on the history of soccer formations and tactics. And it's pretty good. So the next few slides that I'm going to give you are the complete opposite of this book. So this is, this is a 4-4-2. Each team starts the game typically and typically ends each game with 11 players. And these players are traditionally deployed in lines that sort of look like this. They can kind of be combined and thought of as a single team formation, and there are a million different formations that you can kind of configure these 10 players in. But the traditional sort of naming convention is on screen here. It sort of goes 4 defenders, 4 midfielders, 2 forwards means a 4-4-2, right? Each number obviously representing the number of players in each line. And curiously, the nomenclature here excludes the goalkeeper, which always annoyed me. As a bit of a disclaimer, I'm almost certainly going to flip between a couple different sort of names for these different formations and positions. Here I have defenders, but frequently they're referred to as backs or fullbacks. I guess it's short for fullback. Forwards are frequently referred to as strikers, and wide players, particularly sort of your wide midfielders here, are frequently referred to as wingers. But unlike Sarah, I won't confuse football with soccer. The 4-4-2 is probably the most famous formation, and it was easily the most common formation, at least sort of in the 60s, well into the 80s, and in England it probably was dominant into the 90s, and it still pops up, at the highest levels of the game today. There's definitely a few games that we played this year against a 4-4-2, so it sticks around. Arguably, it's even part of the British identity, the 4-4-2. But as it turns out, there's quite a few other ways to also configure 10 soccer players on the field. This is the 3-5-2, which is in practice a bit more defensive, and it's pretty indistinguishable actually from the 5-3-2, which sort of will actually those outside midfielders can also frequently be considered wing backs or also what are defenders. This is a 4-3-3, which is a little bit more aggressive. You kind of have 3 forwards or strikers. Those outside forwards frequently can be called wingers. Again, also could potentially be called a 4-5-1. But there's all kinds of different things there, and this is probably one of my favorites. But there's also the 4-2-3-1, and it's a bit more of a modern formation. It introduces an additional line here, as you see. We have 4 lines now, and we've introduced the defensive midfielder. Really, it's just kind of a 4-3-3 with the midfield flipped upside down. And I actually kind of believe there's only a small handful of sort of parent formations, and all of these sort of derivatives, sort of exists somewhere downstream their sort of respective lineages. It sort of actually reminds me a bit of like chess openings and like transpositions and things like that. I actually refer to these like formation charts as like chess style, right? Where they are mostly like super symmetrical and they're evenly distributed, and they kind of quickly become irrelevant as you get into the mid game. But the motivation behind my talk is really more about formations and systems that are becoming increasingly difficult to classify. These are kind of our classic ones, right? And the reason why I think there are, I guess there are 2 primary reasons why I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to categorize formations. And the first one is because teams are starting to intentionally play with very lopsided formations. This leads to, relative player positioning that is not symmetric, kind of quickly breaking out of that sort of chessboard paradigm. This isn't necessarily new. But it is becoming increasingly extreme. I can kind of flip back and forth here to show you an example. In this example, you're kind of rotating clockwise. Other systems will rotate otherwise. But there's all kinds of different ways that you can kind of rotate and stay balanced. Ultimately, soccer is kind of a game of numerical supremacy, right? And if you're just sort of walking around, completely, in line with all of your teammates, they're not going to kind of develop, there's not going to be a whole lot of opportunities to find advantages in different areas of the fields. And I suspect, this is the case in other invasion sports, but in soccer, you very much sort of have to unbalance yourself on one area of the field to potentially, find an advantage maybe somewhere else, right? And this, unbalancing comes with risks, but I think that's sort of the purpose of tactics, is to sort of like mitigate or accentuate those risks and opportunities. But the second reason why I think formations are becoming increasingly difficult to categorize, and mostly what we're going to talk about today, is more about rotations. Individual players are no longer being asked to simply play their position anymore, right? That's playing your position is something I feel like you hear in a U10 soccer game, a parent sort of yelling at their kids, play your position. But in soccer, it seems like you're being increasingly asked to play multiple positions at once, or potentially swapping with your teammates during different runs of play. And what's being demonstrated behind me here is probably the most common types of rotations. Your outside midfielder is sort of like pinching inwards. Your defensive midfielder might be dropping somewhere along your back line, and your outside back is allowed to sort of plummet forward and taking up a very aggressive sort of attacking posture. And it's this particular sort of behavior that I'm really interested in modeling. We're no longer interested in what position a player was assigned by their coach. Instead, we're sort of interested on a frame-by-frame basis of our tracking data, what position a particular player is playing at an individual moment. So here is one of our lineups from earlier this year. This is, I think, on MLSsoccer.com, and they have listed us as playing a 4-3-3, which was a pretty reasonable guess given the players that we selected to be part of our starting 11. So sort of how this works is about an hour before the game, we hand the referees a list of our starters, and then that sort of gets proliferated on social media, et cetera. But we don't actually have to say what positions those players are playing. We just give them a list of 11 players, and sort of like everybody else tries to figure out in that sort of next chaotic hour what positions you're playing. So they're entirely sort of like a meta construct, right? And what happens here is one of the data collectors has looked at our lineup and said, oh, looks like they're playing a 4-3-3. Let's put that online. However, these were our actual positions for these matches, for this particular match. And notice, that these like the player circles here are all sort of like slightly different shapes and sizes. What you're actually looking at here is a bivariate confidence interval of each player's like relative position to their team's centroid. And as a bit of an aside, like normalizing a player's position to their team's centroid actually reduces the size of these regions really dramatically, and it's a really fun little trick that I picked up from a great paper by Laurie Shaw on formations from a few years ago. But anyway, this sure doesn't look like a 4-3-3. In fact, it looks a whole lot more like almost like a 4-2-4. But we're not 1958 Brazil, and we're not 1962 Soviet Union. Nobody's actually identified as playing as a 4-2-4 in half a century, right? And probably the closest you get to this might be like what the Italians were doing about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when they're doing like a 4-6-0 sort of thing that would shift into a 4-2-4 in the attack. But sort of what I want to pick out here in particular here is the player number 21, Jonathan Azario, who here is, you're sort of seeing him off the left shoulder of the center striker. If we go back to the previous slide, this is Oso over here, being sort of listed as a left midfielder. And, it's not entirely wrong. He is on the left side, slightly. But I think this, sort of illustrates the point that I'm going to try to illustrate. It illustrates the point that I'm trying to illustrate, yeah. Oso in this particular game was asked to play multiple different positions. And given how a particular play evolved in the sort of chaos of soccer, he would sort of fluctuate between positioning himself more as an attacking midfielder at times, and other times more of a sort of withdrawn, like an 8 or something, left-sided center midfielder sort of thing. He would frequently pop up in different positions of the game. So how do we model this? Well, let's think about some features real quick. So here's a particular frame from the tracking data that we have for this particular match. And this one's actually, I've selected this intentionally. This is actually our right midfielder who's pinched inside. We're attacking left to right here, as with, I think, all of our other visuals. And our right midfielder is actually pinched inside and is behaving like an attacking center midfielder. But usually when you're playing a position, what's actually sort of important, as we sort of illustrated in those earlier slides, is it's not necessarily where you are on the field. It's sort of like where you are in relation to your teammates. So I thought about like how we're going to pull together some features here to potentially predict on a frame-by-frame basis what positions these players are playing. And the idea I came was, here's our actual positions for that particular moment. These are our assigned positions by our coach at the start of the game. But the idea that I thought about was, I'm imagining that I'm that particular player in the middle. And what I'm going to do is sort of like start going around in a circle like this. And I'm going to count over a period of time how many players are sort of in front of me, right? So you can see it sort of click up and down here. And if I were to plot those numbers over time, it looks like something like this, right? From 0 to 2 pi radians, right? So we're essentially counting the number of players that are ahead of that particular player. Now, this makes sense that this player was in the middle of the field, so he always has some players ahead and some players behind him, no matter which way he's sort of rotated, right? Here's another example. Who do we think this is?
Goalkeeper.
This is our goalkeeper. Exactly, right? What essentially we did here was take these individual features, these kind of like timestamps of or each like kind of like lin-spaced radians here, and looked at the number of players ahead of a particular of each player, and then used that sort of as our features for this model. But we also need labels. I'm borrowing the position IDs from StatsBomb, where each potential, there's quite a few, obviously you only have 11 players, but these are all the potential positions that you could be assigned to, at least in their data set. So essentially what I'm doing is trying to take these features, right, and predict what label did that player likely was assigned for that particular match, right? And the modeling is actually really quite simple. I've just thrown an XGBoost at it. And in fact, this isn't really a talk about like individual modeling. It's more about sort of the idea that like you can model this sort of thing and it's useful. You can throw all kinds of different sort of classifiers at this. I've done this with neural networks before. You can just probably do it with a logistic regression. It doesn't really matter what you throw at it, to be honest, and that's not the purpose of this talk. But you can kind of take these individual player features and you can, I've reshaped it in a way that sort of reminds you of this. But essentially what we can do here is take individual player rows and predict a position output like this. So maybe in this sort of contrived example, it says, oh, this player is almost certainly the right winger, but also maybe some of those other positions around that area they're possibly likely to be. So with that model in mind, we have a bit of a demo. So I've got this one, which is a quick animation of particular players during a game, right? So you will see some slight flickering. I don't know why he pops up as a goalkeeper there. It's not perfect. The model is trained on roughly about 50 games of Major League Soccer tracking data, and the example here is actually out of sample, so that is good. But I do have another sort of quick example here, which could be kind of cool. So this is from that same game. It's an out of sample game, and this is all of our players in this particular match. And what I can do here is actually click this to show predictions, right? And it will show me, yes, this particular player is probably the left back, left center back, right back, right winger, left winger. This looks about right, but also this is the very first frame of the entire game. What we can also do is maybe scroll forward, and it can essentially rejig all of our different things over time and give us pretty reasonable estimations, right? But you do start to run into situations that look like this. These are set piece situations, and the model obviously gets really confused in these sort of situations, right? These are situations where players are no longer sort of playing their position, and they're asked to do something very explicitly different. And I'm going to come back to this sort of idea in a minute. So we already saw this slide. I'm going to refer back to that in a second. So this is sort of a pseudo confusion matrix that we've got from this particular game. And what we're looking at here is on the left, I have all of my players, all of my starting players. And on the x-axis here, we have all of the different positions that a particular player could be classified as. The numbers in each of the cells is not minutes, it's actually percentage of frames in which they are classified as that particular position. Naturally, we do a really good job with the goalkeeper, right? That one's pretty obvious. We get that one right about 95% of the time. We get the right back correct. We get the right center back pretty correct. We get the left center back pretty correct. We get the left back pretty correct. But the really interesting ones are some of these other players that, say for this particular player, who was assigned as our left center midfielder, about, I lost my cursor, about 37% of the time he was a center attacking midfielder. About 20% of the time he was a striker, and various other sort of bits and pieces. Now, that's actually the player that we were really confused about. That's that same number 21, Jonathan Nazario, who in this particular game was in fact tasked with playing a lot of different positions sort of at once. And what we can do here is sort of see that, which is pretty cool. So getting into sort of like use cases for this, probably the most obvious one here is identifying common positional rotations, right? When I'm scouting for a particular opponent, and I know that maybe they play a 4-3-3, what you really are sort of, you don't have any good information on what kind of flavor of 4-3-3 that they're playing, right? And what I can do now with this particular type of model, I can start to understand what types of rotations are very common within their sort of version of that system, which is pretty cool. It's also a brand new approach for positional profiles from like a player recruiting perspective. Say maybe I want a right defender who 20% of the time actually presents themselves as a right winger, or maybe the opposite. Maybe shows up as a right center back, or maybe I want a right back that is really good at rotating inside and behaving as a right center defensive midfielder. Right? All those different things are very common rotations that you might ask from a right back, and actually now we can start to see and find players that do exactly that particular tactical thing that you're looking for. Similarly, these sort of like rows on the sort of confusion matrix here, we can also treat these as embeddings and that you can potentially use for other models, right? Like say if I'm trying to predict if this particular player would be good at this other thing and I have some other model, I might append these set of embeddings to make a particular model a little bit more robust. It's also, I think, as we demonstrated here, really helpful for like actual error correction, right? This, going back all the way, this is wrong, right? And I know that because I can run this model and take a look at, which positions players were actually playing over time, right? So I can actually go back and make my old sort of historical data set better by sort of cleaning up all these things. Detection of formation changes. This is really common, particularly after substitutions, right? You might notice that, hey, this particular player started as a left winger, but we rotated and, maybe now they're playing as a left midfielder after the 60th minute. That's particularly interesting information. And I think actually the thing that I'm most excited about this is it allows you to exclude moments of high model error. GitHub desktop is ready to install. Here we go. So the set piece situation that I brought up, where the model was really super confused, right? We can actually track the model error over the course of an entire game, and you see these like explosions in set pieces where the model is always very wrong. I know in other sports, and I'm thinking of basketball as an example, you might occasionally, when you're doing player analysis, you might throw out garbage minutes, right? The game's settled, it's a 20-point game, some people are coming in for the last couple seconds of the game, and then, somebody hits a 3 or something. You actually might want to exclude some of those minutes out of your sort of overall player analysis, right? What this actually allows you to do is find strange tactical moments that you may not want to include in those overall analysis of those players, and exclude it from your overall analysis, right? Additionally, it also might be helpful for, like, say, if I'm considering playing a particular player at a position that maybe they don't typically play, but sometimes they rotate into, right? Say I may be considering to play my right back as a right winger during a particular game, right? What we can start to look at here is now actually show me all of the events where my right back was behaving as a right winger, and use all of your downstream models to analyze those events, right? So there's all kinds of different things that you can do with this. That I think might be kind of useful. But anyway, we work in multiple sports, and I don't think this particular model is that useful necessarily in some of these other sports that we work in. Like, I don't think it's that useful in basketball, probably. Maybe a little bit in hockey. But actually, I'm thinking American football could be kind of useful, wide receivers versus cornerbacks or something, or I guess it's safeties versus cornerbacks. My lack of football is probably showing. But there also might be some other examples where sort of this order invariant style feature mapping might be useful to help us understand not just what the position a player has been assigned, but what position they're actually playing when we get into the chaos of the match. That's all I got for you.
All right, thank you. And so raise your hands and Kwong will bring, we got lots of questions.
There's one in here too, if you want to call it. Hi, so would it be worth considering separating when the team has the ball and without the ball? Because a player might be tasked to maybe like a right back invert when they have the ball, but then when they don't have the ball, they might be tasked to like stay in their position and keep that. And also game state as well, like chasing a lead, a player might be out of position just because they're chasing a lead.
Sorry, that was loud. Totally. One thing, I pulled it from my script, but one thing that teams very frequently do is play a different formation in and out of possession, right? What you can actually do with this sort of model is start to see, like actually all of our frames in this particular data set are tagged as being in or out of possession. So I can very easily filter and take a look at, what positions is this particular player playing in attack? What position is this player playing in defense? And I can start to filter in that way. And there's a lot of different sort of, I think, clear analysis that you can do with that sort of separation, which is cool. Yeah.
Sam, was there a question in Steinberg? And then we'll come back to a question here.
Yes, there is. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if this could be used to detect or classify coaching styles. For example, coaches that want to play in a lot of transition versus someone that wants to play a more cynical low block style.
Yeah, for sure. I think the way that we talk about formations in these like very static chess style, symmetrical lines is very limiting, right? Just saying a coach is a 4-3-3 coach or a 4-2-2 coach is not really professional analysis at this point, right? Stuff like this, models like this, can give us a lot more specificity in terms of not just that a particular coach plays a particular position, but also how they play it, right? And if you're an organization who's looking to recruit a particular coach, this can give you, additional sort of details in terms of how they play, for sure.
Hi, Devin. Thanks for the talk today. My question is similar to the first question, because you said something very interesting about how the formation is related to the player's position relative to his teammates, but it's also relative to the ball itself. So, my question is when we're modeling this, could we model sort of off-ball running or off-ball position roles in and of itself off of it?
Yeah, I do think that incorporating the ball in some way could almost certainly would provide additional detail to make this model more accurate, right? But what I find interesting about this particular modeling technique is I actually don't want it to be perfect. I'm actually looking for when it's wrong, because when it's wrong, when a player is playing in a slightly different role than what they were assigned at the beginning of the game, that's actually sort of the insights that I'm looking for, right? So I actually don't want to make the model too good, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Nice talk. So I don't know if you only applied this analysis to Toronto FC or just the MLS, but I was wondering, have you applied this to find the most versatile players? Off the top of my head, someone like Conte in 2021, have you used the different positions they played throughout the game to identify the most versatile players?
Well, we only have tracking data for Major League Soccer. Okay. And since you work for Orlando, I'm not going to tell you if we have done this analysis across a wider list of players in our league.
Any other questions?
Okay. I was just wondering if you mentioned that the model focuses on individual players' positions. Does it kind of focus on the idea, or can it focus on the idea of transitioning from one formation to another, and how the formation as a whole changes, and not just the individual players and where they're located?
I think that's a really good idea. So for example, what you could do is over the course of an entire game, you run the model for every single frame, and you count essentially your lines, right? And you can potentially identify transitions over the course of the game, saying, hey, this team transitions from this formation into this formation more frequently or less frequently than other teams in the league. And that's a potentially useful piece, tactical wrinkle that you could use in opposition analysis, for sure. Great idea.
Okay. Yeah, so
Another one here, and then we'll go. You got it. You're good.
Okay.
I did wait.
Yeah, okay. So yeah. So my main question is that given the fact that this model kind of actually put the players in a different position as the game progress. So my question is that do you think it can also be helpful in terms of like rating of players in like different position, because like oftentimes came across this kind of like who score rating that's like talking about this players like score like 7 points in this game. But actually, if you look at his distribution to the game, you can see that the main reason why he scored this little point is because he's operating in a weird position that he's not really commonly play, and if we just break down his position over different periods of the game, we can probably have a better understanding about where he scored a higher rating in different positions. So yeah.
Right. So, like, say for example, a player played as a right midfielder in the first half, and then was due to injury forced to play right back in the second half, right? But then you look at that player's summary statistics for that entire game, and you might notice maybe for a right midfielder, strangely, he didn't have a lot of passes. Well, that's because the second half he didn't play that position, right? And what you could do with a sort of like player vector like this is you could use this to sort of adjust some of those player level statistics in that particular game, which allow you to better understand, kind of compare against, given the minutes that a particular player played across these number of positions, it gives you better, you could potentially, adjust for that when you're taking a look at how good that player's performance was, right?
Last question.
Hey, Devin. Thank you for the talk. Great talk. So I'm curious. So you titled the presentation talking about the player role classifications, and now we have a better understanding of the players' assigned positions and now their observed positions in the game. But I guess I'm asking, why or how does an understanding of a role, or maybe classifying a role, impact tactical decisions, or do you foresee it impacting roster composition, tactical decisions by roles as opposed to positions?
Yeah, I think so. What we might be demonstrating here is, I don't think that we think a whole lot about flexibility of positions for players, right? Like, I would imagine that's like a good thing, right? From a roster composition perspective, right? It's nice to have players who can play multiple positions, right? We haven't really had ways on like this sort of level of detail to potentially sort of understand just how flexible players might be, right? So if you have a deeper Swiss Army knife of a roster, right? It's like that should be valuable at the end of the season, right? How valuable that is, I don't know, right? But I think it's logical to follow.
All right, let's thank